Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Library Reads In Conversation, Actively Anti-Racist Readers Advisory Program. I'm Rebecca Vnuk, the Executive Director of Library Reads. And if you're not already familiar with Library Reads and what we do, please check out our website, www.libraryreads.org, where you can find out more about our monthly top 10 list we produce, as well as events and trainings. There's also a link at the bottom of our homepage where you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. We specifically wanted to structure this as conversational instead of just talking at people. So please make use of the chat features. If you're not already familiar with Zoom webinars, please notice that there are two different ways to interact actually, via a Q&A box and via the chat box, which I know most of you, hooray, have been using already. So because we have so many attendees right now, we'd love to have you use that chat box for general discussion with other attendees, to ask each other's questions and to answer questions. That would be great. And if you can use the specific Q&A box for specific questions directly to the presenters. If you have a question for one of them in particular, please note that in your question. Otherwise, we're going to assume that the question is for all of them to answer. And we do hope to get to as many questions as we can in the second half of the webinar, but rest assured, we're going to be recording the chat and the Q&A, and we're going to send those out to participants when the webinar is over. We also, yes, are recording the webinar, and it will live on the Library Reads YouTube channel for later viewing. You'll get a link with that as well. So, whoop, muted myself. Let's get right into the webinar. So, I'd like to have you all welcome Robin Bradford, Collection Development Librarian at Pierce County Library System, Annabelle Mortensen, Access Services Manager for Skokie Public Library and current Library Reads Board member, and Becky Spratford, Readers Advisory Specialist with RA for All. So the first thing we wanted to do is talk really briefly about what we mean by anti-racist. So this is from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and their statement is on being anti-racist. To create an equal society, we must commit to making unbiased choices and being anti-racist in all aspects of our lives. Being anti-racist is fighting against racism. Being anti-racist results from a conscious decision to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. These choices require ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection as we move through life. In the absence of making anti-racist choices, we unconsciously uphold aspects of white supremacy, white dominant culture, and unequal institutions in society. Being racist or anti-racist is not about who you are, it is about what you do. So we really wanted to talk about how we look at that in the lens, how we look at that through that lens when we do Reader's Advisory. So let me bring up our panelists for the program. Stop that doorbell from ringing, and go ahead, and we've got all of our panelists here. So let's begin, guys, by discussing creating an EDI mission statement. So Becky, did you want to take off with that?
Yeah, definitely. So a couple years ago, it's been over 2 years now, I realized that, I guess before anti-racist was a term people used, that I wasn't doing enough to be blatant to the people who were hiring me that I was going to promote what I would now call an anti-racist agenda. So I realized that and I put these, the links up to all of the things I'm talking about on my blog, RA for All, for you to learn more. But it all goes back to a midwinter when April Hathcock was very honest about the racist situation that happened to her. And I have a whole thing about it with her permission that you can read on my blog at the link for today. But basically, I realized I wasn't doing enough, just not being racist, and just actively putting books by people of color, LGBTQ, neurodiverse people was not enough. I had to actively do something. So I thought about, well, let's librarian this, right? What do librarians do? And what we do is, and I've been not only a manager, but a library board trustee for 20 years, which seems like it's not true, but it is. And I know mission statements work. And so I created what I called my EDI mission statement. I'm thinking of changing it to an anti-racist mission statement. And this was something that I put up on my website and that I forced every single person who hires me now to sign. It's in my contract. But basically I did it for myself first and foremost. And it's exactly what that slide said. You have to put it at the front of your mind. So in my mission statement, everyone can make their own. I let people know that they are allowed to use mine. I know there's some people on here now who've used it as a model for work they've done to basically say, I'm going to go out of my way to promote, suggest, and encourage you to collect books by people that are not just white heterosexual males. And I even added a statement, because it's the biggest excuse I got, and we're going to talk about excuses a lot today, saying it doesn't matter what your census says. That's in my mission statement. I don't care about the makeup of your community. This is about the world. And I'm going to push that agenda. And if you're not okay with that, basically, don't hire me. But the main reason I did it was also as a warning to them, was for me. I know this is my mission statement. I keep it, it's concise, it's where I can see it every day. And I try to live up to it. And I think when I have that, it reminds me to do that every day, to be anti-racist with my Reader's Advisory every day.
And circling back to the census point, this is something that I hear quite often. We only have, this percentage of our community is this, so we don't really need to have these books, or we can have one or two, but we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. And that's almost the opposite of what is actually true. Like, the less interaction you have with people that are different than you, the more that you need to simulate that in some other way, because that is how you begin to understand the world around you. Like you said, it's not just about your census tract and who lives there and who's going to be visiting your library. It's about what you understand about the bigger world.
It's interesting because Annabelle's library, and I'll, when you talk about yours, but that's, people said to me, I live near Annabelle, and they'd be like, well, Skokie does it because they have everybody on their census. And it was great that you guys took the lead, but I don't live that far from Skokie. I live in the same county. We could talk about how long it takes. That's a thing with Annabelle and I. But, and my town is a lot less diverse in the census, but we all work with each other.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that one thing that I think about a lot based on what you're saying, actually two things. Number one is, 100% to Robin's statement about it doesn't matter who you are. This is important, and this is part of being a human in the world. But also, and that's true of however homogenous a community is, or how homogenous you think a community is, because often, you think that it's homogenous, and guess what? It's not. But also, this doesn't just apply to white straight people. I mean, I need to read more widely. I need to have an anti-racist lens. I need to counteract bias and counteract, just structural issues that are baked into everything that we do. So I think that kind of gets to your point, Becky, of that's why this is different than just putting a diverse book on the display. It really has to be active in a way where you realize what you're counteracting. You realize what you're up against, both from a societal norm, but also just yourself. And I think that people who would talk about my library community, which is a very diverse community, it's just always, I feel like that's such a false argument in so many levels, and really just an incredibly, weak, it's just an excuse. It's just an excuse for not trying harder and doing harder. And, and to me, it's very much akin, like, and we're going to get to this in a second, of, you know, I don't want to do RA for science fiction because I don't read science fiction. So that other person's going to do science fiction RA. It's the same thing, you know, it's the same thing.
Well, and it's very interesting. I don't know which one of you said it, but about, I think it was you, Annabelle, about the, it's society. Like, people take this very personally. Like, if they're not doing it, then you're doing something wrong and it's because you're a bad person. And it's like, that's not it. And everyone has grown up under these rules. So we all have a little bit of that in us, no matter how diverse we might be from the majority. We all still have grown up with these rules, with these thoughts. Like, a lot of people who come from diverse backgrounds might still think if a book isn't reviewed, it's not a good book. And that's very much an unequal statement, just in every way that it possibly could be. Who is doing the reviewing? Who gets the contracts from big publishers that magazines review? Just every single way that you think it should be an equal playing field, it is not. But if you still have that mindset, you're helping to uphold white supremacy. And we need to not.
And then the thing is too, is, and you both brought this up, you just can't do it anymore. And so you can only start with yourself. I hear all the time from librarians who are library workers who are like, you know, well, there's nobody else who reads those books here, or I have to read the bestsellers because they're all white people. And so my first argument is, okay, well, there's this thing called the internet. So you can use that to learn about the new James Patterson book, or learn about the new whatever that white person book is that you know your library's getting, and you know your library is going to order, and spend your time reading books that maybe, one, Robin, you're exactly right, didn't get reviews, but you heard were good, or books that, you know, represent a viewpoint that you're missing in your collection. And we'll talk about diversity audits today. But you got to start with you. Use yourself as an example. And so by creating a personal mission statement, that's why I say don't start by telling don't go back and be like, Becky and Robin and Annabelle said you had to do this. You're going to get people who, like Robin said, take it personally. And even though we put up a statement that doesn't let you take it personally, start with yourself. Lead by example. Don't make excuses for yourself, and just start book talking books by people that don't represent what, and I could go on and on, but unfortunately the norm, like Robin said, is white heterosexual. And that's not right, because it's not a norm. It's just what we've made the norm. So if you break that by just talking about all books equally, no matter who they're written by or for, which is a whole nother thing, but put yourself first. And I think a mission statement is something every library worker knows, understands, and can do. And write one for yourself. Maybe get your coworkers to write one, and then move on from there.
So coming off of that, Becky, I wanted to ask you guys for maybe some practical tips on doing this, the EDI mission statement. Is this something that you suggest that people not only should have written down, but is that something then that, you know, maybe not your personal one, you wouldn't broadcast everywhere, but if you do one for your library, is that something that you would put on your website, or is it something that you would have printed off and put at a service desk? Or tell us a little bit about some of the practicalities of doing an EDI mission statement.
Sure. So when you start with yourself, the first thing you need to do is just think about how you do reader's advisory anyway. So when we're going to talk about reader likes later, one of the things I've done, it's not in my mission statement, but I've made a pledge to never only offer straight white male reader likes for a book, even if it's the most straight white male book you've ever read. I will not. And I happen to do that in print, in Booklist and Library Journal, but you can do that yourself. And we'll talk about diversity audits. So just make a list of the things you already do, and then think about ways you can put concerns about equity, diversity, inclusion in the forefront of what you do. And so maybe deal with what you're doing. So when we talk about things like ordering, go out of your way to find books that aren't reviewed. But in terms of like a department or a library, you know, I saw, and I was part of, as a trustee, our library did a Black Lives Matter statement here. And it was one of the better ones, I will say, but it's not enough in my feeling. Like I see these and it's just about the library stands behind Black Lives Matter, right? But how? And so if each department kind of works in concert to create sort of their goals, whether their goals are, you know, to make sure every display, I give some examples in the talks I give that uses that 30%, you know, diverse ratio, that you never put up a display, a list, you audit everything you do. So you never put up a display that isn't at least 30% own voices, at least 50% women, and do that every single time. So those are examples.
And if you're a department, use it for training. So when you train people to do readers advisory, whether that's in a department or across a library system, new employees, old employees, use it as a training tool, not just something that you put up and, you know, that's it. It's a living document. So you have to therefore push it out to people and keep it up to date. Don't just let it sit like so many collection development policies. They are done in, you know, 2002 and they're still up on your website. And don't let this be one of those things.
I have something, you know, it's not easy. I'm going to say that too, because I hear from library workers all the time, and there's one on here, I won't call her out, but I know she's had a rough time because we've talked a lot off, you know, the internet on email. You're going to hit resistance. So I was asked a few years ago to be part of this Illinois State Standards reviewing of their Reader's Advisory section, the Illinois Library Handbook, wherever the new one came out. And this was a couple years ago, and I outright said, I refuse to be involved if you don't let me put in a statement about being actively putting equity, diversity, inclusion in the forefront. I wish I thought of anti-racist as a term back then. And they were hemming and hawing, not the people in the committee, but the larger people. And I literally remember this in a meeting room in Peoria, Illinois, getting in an argument with the former president of the Illinois Library Association, who straight up said, well, my community is white and they're super Christian. And I bet Annabelle knows this community. My community is white and they won't stand for that. I'm like, no, actually, they live in Chicagoland, where guess what? We're super diverse. They live in the world. Guess what? There's all kinds of people. I literally stood up in a meeting and nobody came to my defense, but afterward they did. So sometimes you have to be the voice in the room and demand that people put these things in practice and use them, right? Exactly what Robin said. This should be part of your training. This should be part of your library. I'm currently working on, I can't believe it's like my 5th long-range plan. And we're putting this in. I'm not letting this long-range plan go out. For my tiny little 15,000 town person, you know, right outside Chicago, though, we're not going to put out our long-range plan unless there's an active anti-racist statement about our services and our collections in it, because I know our library uses the plan for service.
All right, great. Let's move on into talking about collections, since that is sort of the prerequisite for Reader's Advisory, is having the books there to talk about. So we'll talk a little bit about collections, and then we'll move into doing the Reader's Advisory interview through the EDI lens. But let's talk about collections. Let's talk about, there are 2 topics I'd like you guys to sort of spin off on here. First of all, if you've got some quick things to say about diversity audits. I know that's a big thing that people are looking into and they want more information on. And then let's also talk about how creating these collections goes into discoverability. Robin, I know we've had a couple of questions that came through on the chat asking about finding some of these books that aren't always reviewed in traditional sources. And I know that that's, you know, one of the areas that you are really big on, and talking about indie books and indie publishers. So if we could also talk about that here in this section as well, that would be great. So I will let you guys, why don't we start off with diversity audits, whoever wants to start talking about that first, and then we can move on into creating your collection for discoverability.
I can start with audits because I think starting there then is a very nice segue into Robin. She always has great ideas about where to find these mystical titles, you know, out in the world. So audits are I've gotten a lot of questions recently on audits. It's kind of funny to me because I've been talking about audits for about 4 years now. And consistently the questions I get are, number one, how do you do them? And I feel that our resources, you know, Google University, there are resources out there. Karen from Teen Librarian Toolbox has excellent resources on her blog. Karen Jensen, I wrote an article for LJ, she wrote an article for LJ, other people in personal blogs have examples. So there are lots of tools out there to figure out exactly how you might implement it. The important pieces I feel to keep in mind about diversity audits is, number one, it is an audit. So you start because you're looking to see what it is you have. You're looking to set your baseline. You are not doing any percentages at that point. You are not, you know, figuring out what you want to build from it at that point. You are literally just figuring out, it's like going into your pantry and figuring out how many boxes of pasta you have. You know, how many boxes of pasta do you have, and how do you break it down? Then from there, once you have those baseline results, you talk about, okay, where do we want to go from here? Where can we go from here? What training do we have for staff? What resources do we look at? What can we do? And then after you do some stuff for a while, guess what? You have to go back and audit again. You have to see whether you've moved the needle or not. You have to see again whether you've actually taken action and made a difference. And seeing, you know, discover what holes, because there might be some areas we're actually doing quite well in and others that you're not. The second important thing about audits is they're hard. So everyone wants, you know, the magic bullet of, is there a spreadsheet somewhere that can just figure it out? Or, oh my God, you mean I actually have to look at books and figure this out? Yeah, you do. Sorry. So a key is, Robin's cracking up because I know she's doing it, working on an audit right now, and I feel like probably she's hearing these from people in her library system. You, I feel, need to start small. You need to look at subsets. Now that could be either, you know, some IT or ILS pulling of random bibs that become a subset that are manageable. That can be a representation. That can be looking at a particular genre. If you have a very small library, like there are some school libraries, for example, that do an audit of their whole collection. Some small libraries actually do, but they have very, very, very few, you know, books, bib records, to use the cataloging term, you know, to look at. At our library, what we did a few years ago is we looked at what we chose for book discussions. Also, we're looking at what we choose for our form-based RA program that we have online, among a few other things in terms of making it very specific and small. Some libraries, what they do, and I actually think this is something that we're talking about doing another audit in the coming months, and I think we're going to do it this way, is looking at our orders. So pulling out a subset of our vendor orders from the last year and taking a look and then comparing it to our orders in the future, which I think is particularly important in, you know, the age of COVID, because all of our budgets are under pressure now, and many of us are cutting our physical materials budgets. And really, you know, I hear a lot of, well, we're just really focusing on the bestsellers. And so that is going to, with some exceptions, very quickly really limit you into, you know, Patterson land. One other thing that is super important with the audit, which I just can't convey this enough, it's not going to be perfect. You just, you know, you just need to do it. It's going to feel weird. You're going to think you're doing it wrong. You're thinking about the data and, oh my gosh. You know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Just do it. Just pick something, just do it, look at it, talk about it. And, you know, so just an example, when we did our book discussions, we found that we were doing a fairly decent job in terms of having, you know, diverse authors in book discussions, but a very strong, a high number of those authors were international authors. So we weren't looking, for example, at African American authors. We were looking at authors who were from Africa and writing about the African experience, or Latino writers, you know, with books set in South America as opposed to the Latin American experience with things in the United States. We also saw we were doing a terrible job with both native writers where we had none. And we also looked at disability. We realized later on that when we do it again, we probably want to include neurodiversity in that, which is something we didn't include the first time. So it's a work in progress. So just don't be afraid of it. I think a lot of people just get really freaked out. It's a lot of work, so just make it manageable and just do it. And then take action to then do something about it for the next time.
And let me say then, because Annabelle's talking about the whole collection, I want to talk to those of you who are like, this is great, but I have no power at my library. I'm just a library worker on the desk. That's not an excuse not to do this, okay? You can mention it to the people above you, but there's things you can do, and you can audit yourself. And this is something I actually learned from Skokie and the suggestions you make, because I know one of the first things you guys did was saw that your automatic or your computerized book suggestion thing you do had too many white books, to suggest from.
Yeah, you can do book lists.
Yes.
You can do your displays.
So make sure you audit yourself.
Small scale.
Right. Do it on because again, and Robin's going to start talking about the excuses she's starting to hear as they just started this process, I think, but you have no excuse to do nothing yourself. You can always do better. You can always say, hey, I'm putting out this list and I'm going to make sure it is representative, and I'm going to put up this display and make sure it's representative. And I think that's extremely important for everyone here to understand. Every single one of you, if you work at a circulation desk and you talk to a patron ever, which I know happens even on the phone these days, you need to think about what you're suggesting to people.
Yeah, we're just starting the diversity audit process, and I was laughing at Annabelle because so many of the things that she said don't get bogged down in, we're getting bogged down in. So it's definitely, we're trying to answer all the questions before we've even touched one book, and trying to figure out the process and what percentage is good percentage. And it's like, no, first we actually have to see what the collection has in it before we start thinking about how we're doing. Just,
Yeah,
so
it's not an analysis right now, it's an audit. That is
it's an audit,
what
right?
Audit is. It's counting.
And I think so many people want to do it right. Like there's this pressure right now to have a diverse collection, and you're not going to have one overnight. So many of the things that Annabelle said about doing diversity audits also applies to buying books for your collection. Like it's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to be able to do it with one order from Baker and Taylor. It's a process, and it takes a long time to do it. And another caveat is I do this as a full-time job. I don't have any programming responsibilities. I don't have any reference desk responsibilities. My only job, besides meetings, so many meetings, is to add books and other materials to our collection. So keep that in mind. A lot of people don't have just a collection job. So you don't have all the time in a work week to spend looking for that one title that is, made a mention in an ad, in a magazine. Like you don't have that time. So keep that in mind and don't get overwhelmed. But there are a lot of places that we look at all the time. We just don't necessarily look at them as places to add books to our collection, like NetGalley. Like people go there and they look for galleys to read for blog writing or, whatever reason. But that's a good place to actually go to add things to your collection. And NetGalley specifically has a lot of indie pub authors. So I am on NetGalley probably every other day, if not every day. And I'm not always there to get books. Sometimes I'm using it as a discovery place. Same with Edelweiss. They have, in my opinion, fewer indie pub books, but they have a lot of material, and it's better searching and better. I can go in and make it just romances that are coming out in the next few months through the end of 2020, or romances that are just coming out in these 2 weeks in September. Like, you can narrow it down as much as you want to. So that's a good place. There's places like Forward Magazine, which the last time I subscribed to it, it was free to library staff. So get on that. And they specialize in indie books. Ingram's catalog, which I don't know if they're still doing paper catalogs or not, since I'm not in the office to get one. But they also have a section in their catalog. They call it, I think, publishers previews or something, but it's indie books. So that's a good place to look as well. Blogs, Twitter, people are talking about books. There's Women of Color in Romance is a Twitter profile that every week highlights women of color who have released romance books that week.
And
so
Robin, there's ones for diverse speculative fiction. There's one for diverse horror. Like, they're all there doing the work. And I do want to give a shout out to Anna Mickelson, who's on this Zoom, who creates a list that she updates on Google of by genre of diverse books that are coming out. And I always have a link to it, with her permission, on my 10 Rules of Reader's Advisory at the bottom of the page. I just think that that's very good too. And I believe it's open so anyone can add to it. So there are resources there.
Yes.
You just can't rely on, Library Journal and Book List only, because I know I write for them. I try to write reviews as many horror books as I can by as many people of color or, diverse. And I can't physically do it. I just, I can't. So we're trying.
Not everything is getting reviewed, but we need to maybe divorce ourselves from the review requirement. Just because someone liked it or didn't like it doesn't mean that people in your community won't like or will like it. Can't tell you how many 5-star review books sat on my shelf and got dusty, because it may be a fantastic book, but if it doesn't grab anybody's interest, they won't check it out. So I understand that people use reviews as a way to not be overwhelmed or not spend their entire budget in January, but we need to loosen that up a little bit so that there's room to go in and get books that people may have an interest in. An example I use all the time is climate fiction. Like, you're starting to see a few more reviews of things like that, but there's a ton. And once people have read that layer that has been reviewed, what else are you giving them?
Yeah. And
it's because we're not seeing the other things that are out there because they're not reviewed, but your patrons want to read them because this is their lane. And so they want to read deeper into it.
That reminds me too of one of my tricks is, in climate fiction is one of my examples I use too, is the super duper micro bestseller lists on Amazon. We talk about people who are love the books that get good reviews by readers, not by librarians who reviewed it. So things like, I know for Native American example, Annabelle, when you're looking for that, they go down to that small subcategory, right? So if you're looking for specific books, climate fiction, but really super small things, writers with a specific identity, stories about a specific, down to the minutia, you can find bestsellers. And then those are books that are proven winners with people with their money, their own money that they bought. It's worth giving a try. And then I have a friend, Karen Tunin, who runs collection development for Naperville Public Library. And she always says, when in doubt, she adds it to their e-collection, because Overdrive's getting a lot better about adding the really smaller presses. I've helped a lot of horror small presses get on there. And
they're a lot cheaper.
Yeah, it's a lot cheaper. And so and for those who don't know, Naperville, Illinois is the 3rd biggest city in Illinois. So we're not talking about a tiny library here. she said she's done this for years and it works. She adds them and then what she does is she says if they get popular, then she adds paper because she's proven it. So there's but those Amazon lists are so helpful. You don't have to buy them from Amazon, but they're super helpful for you to identify those books.
Yeah, and so one thing to keep in mind too is, okay, so people coming to the library, readers, how is something popular to them? You know, why do they pick the books that they're picking out? Well, in some cases, it's because an author that they already enjoy. And so they're going to get that author again. In other cases, it's that it's on a bestseller list or someone gave it to them at told them about it word of mouth. But in a lot of cases, it's just because you have it on the news shelf, or just because you have it on the display shelf, or just because you are, guess what, book talking it to them or giving it to them as a recommendation or suggestion, however you fall in the recommendation suggestion dichotomy of Reader's Advisory. So all it is you saying like, hey, this is something good in some way, and they'll grab it. That's true of any book, but a lot of the books, let's look at first-time authors for an example. A lot of the books that get the buzz are because they have a huge marketing department behind them, because we're all getting galleys, because we're all hearing about it, and great book, and God bless them, and I love Workman, and we love them at Library Reads, they're great, but An American Marriage, we were all hearing about that book a year before it came out. I mean, you couldn't like go near a library conference, a library thing, a library ever, without like getting slapped in the face by that book, which, all respect to them because they knew it was a great book, they knew it was an important book, and they put so much power behind it. But that's what we're that's what these other books aren't dealing with, like that's what they don't have, but we can provide that for them. And if you don't have them in your collection, you have to tell your collection development people about them. If you don't do collection development yourself, like you have to beat the drum for these books.
A lot of authors that I personally know talk a lot about there may be diversity in traditional publishing. Now it's starting to get more and more. There's still not diversity in how those publishing and how those marketing dollars are doled out. So a lot of people, even if they are trad pubbed, aren't getting the same push by any stretch of the imagination. So they finally have scored their traditional publishing contract and not seeing a lot of marketing dollars, still doing the majority of the marketing themselves.
I think a great example, and it's very, very new, and it has to do with Library Reads, is Silvio Mourinho Garcia's Mexican Gothic. And I've worked with Silvia, and when this book was set to come out, her and I worked together. We were supposed to talk with Robin and Sonali Dev at ALA about horror and romance. But I also was working with her to get a review of her book and to get an interview with her into Library Journal. And she is one of those authors who, she is Mexican Canadian, and she does not write about escaping Mexico. She writes just about Mexican people doing spooky things. And I loved Mexican Gothic. It spoke to me. It was amazing. It was such a fresh Gothic horror book, and it's horror. This is not like Rebecca, it's, maybe all in her head. This is like, there's a monster, so be ready for that. And she pushes, she talks, and she is confrontational about how little marketing dollars she's gotten in her career, how little respect she's gotten. This is a side thing, but I think it's important to say too, when people of color push their books because they're not getting the marketing budget, they're labeled as difficult. And this happened with Silvia, actually. Years ago, I wanted to bring her to a conference, and she said, you know what, Becky, unless somebody pays for me to go as a person of color, I don't go unless I'm paid for, because so many can't. And I said, great, some other day. This year, for 2021, we were picking guests of honor for StokerCon, and someone texted me, the president, to say, we're thinking about Silvia, but I've heard she was difficult. And I'm like, oh no, she's not difficult. She just stands up for herself. And this is another issue we have to bring in there too, I think. But so Silvia pushed her book herself. I'm going to tell you this behind the scenes. Her publicist was fired since March. Okay, this book just came out June 30th. I got a new publicist involved. I was trying to figure stuff out. I wanted to promote this book. And she did it almost all herself and had to argue even to get the book published. Well, then, not only was it a #1 library reads pick, because librarians love her, I told her that. They're not scared of you for some reason. They're scared of other horror authors. And then it was an actual hardcover New York Times bestseller, okay? And it took her years. She talks about it. Now Tor Nightfire is reprinting her out-of-print amazing Mexican vampire book. Her other books are getting, people are looking at her, and she's still out there doing the same thing. You know, it's not all about escaping Mexico. It's not all the horrible things. This is a 1950s, it's about a rich girl from Mexico, you know, because guess what? There were people, right? This is not just people going across the border, and it's all the stuff everyone's talking about, but she had to get it out there for you to find it. And it took her years till she got the Penguin Random House deal for a horror book. And so it's, and even then, you know, she had trouble, but she beat the odds. But it is extremely tiring. She talks about that too. And I think it's important to bring that up.
She just had a really good Twitter thread about that.
Yeah, she does.
A while ago, like I think earlier this week, maybe, where she was talking about how, you know, people only want to hear those refugee stories from Latinx authors. And it's like, no, sometimes we're just writing the cool horror story. And why aren't you okay with that?
She also talks about how all South American Mexican books are not magical realism. And I think that's really important too, because that happens. I know. So if you read the interview I did with her in Library Journal, we really talk about that. But I think Annabelle's
Can I just say real quick, also, librarians love her because Gods of Jade and Shadow,
yes,
her great fantasy book, was a Library Reads pick in 2019.
And it won the Rusa Codes #1 fantasy book. And I told her that. I'm like, we got to get you to talk about horror because they're not scared of you, lady.
Rebecca would yell at me if I didn't mention that.
Well, yes, right, you know.
Well, and Mexican Gothic was #1 though, so.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
So I want to kind of circle back to diversity audits. Now, as I said at the top, we are taking these questions, and that's going to be kind of the second half of our program is answering the audience questions. But 2 questions have come up that I think we can get to them right now while we are talking about collections, and they're sort of similar. We have a question asking if a diversity audit specifically addresses the identity of an author.
Yeah.
Is it aiming for own voices and not necessarily diverse books by non-POC authors? And then also a question has come up asking if you should differentiate audits based on by, for, and about. So can you guys speak to that quickly?
Before, I'm going to say one thing and then you guys talk. Patterson's Cross series is not diverse just because he's Black. I've seen people do that. So I know Robin talks about it on Twitter. So you go.
Wow. I haven't seen that. It's amazing. So real quick, the answers to all those questions are yes, in the sense that, guess what? There's not a diversity audit police. There's not a diversity, like you can do it how you want. Yes, that would be an element of it. I want to say the one thing, I mean, there's so many tricky things about it, which again, like don't let the perfect be enemy of the good. Own voices does not mean diverse. Like Silvia Garcia Moreno is Mexican Canadian. If she's writing a book about Cubans, that's not own voices. That's, you know, again, own voices is the tradition. Now, if it's something where it's, you know, the story is about the immigrant experience and it reaches to that, then of course, and of course, you know, we want to support these authors, but I think own voices, breaking out, is it own voices versus is it diverse? Mm-hmm. Or I hate that term diverse, but you know what I mean. Kind of then starts taking an audit to a level that you're going to have a lot of time in your hands, and you're going to have to do a lot of research on authors. And I think that in some cases, that is not the same as like James Patterson, Alex Cross.
It's a stop sign. So the more that you add, and your Excel spreadsheet is now 9 pages long. But it's a, like you said, you're gonna have to be doing a lot of research. Maybe an easier way to do it, and one thing that we've talked about, because it seems like we've talked about everything but not done anything yet, would be if it's a white person writing about a non-white character. So that's an easy layer. You don't have to worry about, is it a Mexican Canadian writing about a Cuban? Like, you don't have to go into that level of detail, but you know it's from a, I don't even know, it's not dominant culture, but you, like Annabelle said, you know what I mean? Writing
Right.
about someone else. And
And
so
it goes the other way around. Sorry, Robert, when we did our audit, one of the books, and I can't remember which one of his books was it, but it was a Kazuo Ishiguro book. I think it was Buried Giant, I think. And it's like, so that's different, right? I mean, he's British Japanese, I believe British Japanese.
Yes, he is, yes.
You know, or his other, Remains of the Day.
right.
That's a butler. That's a Nazi butler. You know? So, I mean, and we had like a back and forth, and I can't remember what we decided. I mean, we just put it, so we divided it by character. So we personally did main protagonist or protagonists, and we did author. And then if we didn't know enough about either, like, or if we couldn't figure it out, we just put NA, you know, I mean, again, we didn't try to get bogged down. And then
And then there,
I think
there
it
is
makes a difference.
things.
I mean, you definitely want, we're librarians, we want all the information, but you definitely do want to know if all your books that have diverse characters are written by white people.
white people.
Because that
Yeah.
that says something.
Yeah.
So you
And it's not what
definitely-
you want to project. It's
Yeah,
not
and
actively
And
anti-racist.
it's also not always a value judgment. I think this gets back to, again, the feelings part of it, and we just kind of get too lost in our feelings. So one of my favorite books, and one of my favorite authors is Stuart Onan. And Last Time at the Lobster is one of my all-time favorite books. And I love it in part because it talks about the working class in a way that I don't feel like we see enough of in mainstream fiction, and in a very like generous, you know, funny and very humanistic way. And the number two thing is Stuart Onan, like, you know, the name kind of says it all. The main character is Dominican. He's a Dominican male. And I remember when I read it, I was so surprised about it, because it was just like, you know, the main character is a good guy. He's not in a gang. He doesn't do drugs. He doesn't, you know, he doesn't domestically abuse anyone. He's not in trouble with the law. I mean, maybe he smokes a little pot. But it was just like, he was just a guy in the world. And so while, you know, when we say a white author writing in a different milieu, it's not always, you know, it's not always American dirt, for lack of, you know, a better term.
No, not at all.
But you still want to make sure, to Robin's point, like that's not all you're doing. Like, that's not.
And it could be that's all you're seeing, because that's all that's being marketed, because a whole long list of reasons that we've already talked about. So that's the thing that you need to know too. Like, I need to look beyond these places because, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color are not being represented as authors in my collection.
And I think that's so important. I think we could get caught in the weeds of whether or not we're going to mark them as diverse or not in our audits all day. And that's not really the point. I think the first thing you need to do is not identify who the stories are about. If you're really going to start this, you need to start with the authors and their identity, and see who you're representing. And is the only Native American author in your collection Louise Erdrich? Well, that's not okay, right? I also saw somebody write in the chat, and I you know, hopefully we'll have a discussion, way to talk about this, about discoverability, but, you know, do you have an African American section at your library? And I'm on the record as saying no. And but before I tell you no, should you not have one, I ask you, because I know what the answer is. Well, you have an African American section, great. Where's Toni Morrison and where's Colson Whitehead? Because I'm going to tell you 99% of the time, they're with the white books, okay? They are. They're not in your African American section. And that is a huge microaggression to do that. So the fact is, that's the number one reason why you shouldn't do it. You ask yourself that question. But the number two thing you need to understand is, if it's about discoverability and we want everyone to find books about everybody, they need to all be together, right? So if we're getting caught in the weeds about, is this a diverse book? You're trying too hard to micromanage it all. I say put all the books together, and I'm a huge proponent of not putting genre sections either, unless we're talking about, formats. I know people, I know I'm gonna get strung up, I know, but guess what? We have this thing called our computerized OPACs, and you can add the keywords and people find things. I try to use a non-genre explanation for this, of why it could work, that's so obvious that people are like, oh, maybe I'll actually listen to her crazy idea. So, if you say, at a library I was working with, they had no more room for their nonfiction DVDs. And so they said, you know what? We need more fiction DVDs. So we're going to interfile our nonfiction DVDs with the books. Okay. And they did this because they already had the call numbers. They knew where they were going. And there were a few people that got mad. Where are my nonfiction DVDs? And they said, we have this thing called the OPAC, and we're going to show you how to use it to find every nonfiction DVD. And you can browse them on the computer. But here's the thing. It sounds so stupid that we did this before, that we separate them. But now at this library, the Rick Steves books are next to the Rick Steves videos. Here's just a really blatant example, right? Travel. There were people who never knew we had the books. They had the books and never knew they had the videos because they were ghettoizing it by format. This is a non-racial thing to get angry about, or genre thing to get angry about, to show that we have catalogs. We can add key terms. We can add discovery terms. And we, the public desk people, it doesn't have to be the catalogers only. We can add the terms that people are actually asking us for when they look for these books, so that we don't end up with a section for every little genre, every little niche, every little person. We just have books. We can pull out displays. We can make lists. We can add things for discoverability to the catalog so people can find all of them. But most importantly, they're in a collection that has everything. Because I'm telling you, there are some of those little old white ladies who you give them Colson Whitehead and they read it, right? Or you give them Silvio, Mourinho, Garcia and they read it. But if there was a Mexican author section or a Black author section, they would never
go there.
They would never find it.
Yeah, I will say my collection's too big not to have genres, and I'm also very, very pro-genre.
No collection's not too big.
But one thing that's, because I've heard this African American section thing before, which is, I'm sorry, I don't understand that at all in any sort of way. But that's different. Some people use that when they actually mean street lit, which is an actual genre with actual like genre conventions, and yeah, I mean, I
can explain it. I mean, there is logic behind it. I hate it, but it makes sense. If once upon a time, there were not very many popular fiction African-American authors. You had Terry McMillan, you had B.B. Moore Campbell, Omar Tyree, Eric Dromey, and you're about done. There's a few more, but some often in genre romance that of course were not in the regular collection because they were paperback originals. And those were on spinner racks. We didn't talk about that. So it was hard for people in a big, huge collection to find the African-American popular fiction that they wanted. But these days are not those days.
Yep.
And there are a lot of authors now, but people have gotten used to just going to one section and seeing it. And when I was in Indianapolis, I did have the issue of people wanting street lit, but saying African-American fiction. And when you do a reader's advisory interview and you ask them, well, are you talking about Zora Neale Hurston? Well, no, I'm talking about Triple Crown books. Okay, that's a thing. You want urban fiction or street lit. And so I understand why people had, as in past tense, African-American fiction sections.
So this seems like a good place to segue into more reader's advisory chat at this point right now, because that's definitely, part of the discoverability process, right, is doing the actual reader's advisory work as well. I want to remind folks to be watching the chat because we've got some great back and forth happening here over what people are doing in their own collections as well. And when you're doing that, make sure that you've got your chat switched to all panelists and attendees. We're seeing a lot of questions come in that are only going to the panelists. So please do utilize that chit chat and then use the Q&A box at the bottom for specific questions we can answer near the end of the webinar. But let's keep talking now about Reader's Advisory. So talking about that kind of stuff, there are a couple of points that I want to make sure that we hit in this next section, including challenging others to read widely, challenging yourself to read widely, of course, first, but then how do you challenge not only yourself, but other library staff that you're working with, and then challenging your patrons to read widely as well. And then how about, can we talk a little bit about in Reader's Advisory, not profiling readers and thinking that you know what they're asking you for or what they're looking for. And that kind of goes into this, right? Are you talking about street lit or are you talking about a Black author? So let's maybe get into that at this point. How does that sound?
Can I just say, I see in the chat a lot of people like street lit, urban fiction. Street lit is a genre and urban fiction it's under the umbrella of urban fiction.
It's like an umbrella, yeah.
Yeah, so for those who
so
are asking.
I want to talk about how to get your patrons to read, because I have an example, but the simple answer is gamify it. I'm not kidding, right? So Deerfield Public Library in Northern Illinois, not far from Annabelle, they won an award from the Adult Reading Roundtable for this program they did, where they literally got, and I have permission to say this from the person who ran it, little old well-meaning white ladies, rich white ladies, who thought that they were so woke, who weren't reading any diverse books, and the staff there challenged them with this Read Without Borders, and I have links to it in the slides on my blog. But they gamified it, and they basically gave them, like, you know, prizes and chances to win prizes for reading more diversely, and they gave them cues, kind of like a book riot or one of these other reading challenges, right? But they did it as a winter reading program, and you can talk to them now about it. That those people, the ladies that they never read anything other than the books they heard about or the New York Times told them to read, are now asking for the most diverse books. They're like struggling to keep the collection up because they gamified it. So that's example number one, is to gamify it for your patrons. But really, and I'm just gonna say this quickly and then I'll let them talk, but leading by example. I can't stress that enough. I made my staff, we had a goal of what to read, and they had to read across genre, across perspective, and it was part of their plan every year. They had to. But the rest of the staff, we challenged them to just read a book that they might not know about. We gave them all the different Pop Sugar, Book Riot reading lists to help them, right? Read a book by a trans author, read a book in translation, like whatever that was. We asked them to use it. And then we asked them to participate in our staff recommendation shelves, no matter what department they worked in. You have to invite people in. And I worked in the Berwyn Public Library, which is just outside of Chicago, and it's an extremely diverse community, and almost all, though, Mexican American. And our staff was extremely diverse. Our librarians were not. And that's a problem everywhere too. So we encouraged staff who weren't librarians to be involved. What are you reading? Tell me about it. You don't have to write anything to be on the staff recommendation shelf. Just put your name on it. Like, limit the barriers. So that's how you do it. You got to limit the barriers for people to participate. You have to let them know that they just need to share books they're passionate about, but give them goals. I say, if you did this white book, you got to do something else, right? And I held them to a standard as the person in charge, and I held myself to a standard. I went out of my way to do almost all diverse books to counterbalance the other tendencies.
Yeah, I think that one thing to be careful of, though, is when it's phrased like as a challenge, it kind of others those books.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's kind of like, it's a challenge to read these, like it's homework. So it's not, I mean, one thing that we were going to get into a little bit later that I know we all feel very passionate about, and I know Robin has all sorts of opinions about, is a lot of these books are fun. They are fun to read. It's a ripping yarn. It is sexy times. It is, you know, a heist thriller. It is a good mystery. So, you know, I'm just the challenge aspect of it. Also, because there are so many diverse titles within fiction already and within genres already. and it's more of like the discovery aspect. So I think, you know, Becky, you do something in terms of like your appeal factors for like what you enjoy as a staff member is kind of a starting point of talking about patron appeal factors. When we're talking about these books, we really are talking a lot of times about appeal factors. We're not talking about the frame. So, you know, like the book In West Mills is small town, everybody, you know, really sharp characters, really sharp, observant family dynamics and community dynamics. It happens to be set in an African-American community, but it's really about like the dynamics. So someone who loves Ann Tyler may also, you know, that would be a great read for them. So I think it's kind of, you know, it's a balance of you need to stretch yourself, but you need to do this if you're doing reader's advisory well, you need to do this in every way. So you need to read fantasy, you need to read romance. Then you need to see, okay, am I reading within those genres a diverse field of authors? Am I just going to the bestseller list? Am I just, you know, doing Regency romance, which I personally love. I adore Regency romance, but it's very Caucasian. I'll tell you that, unless you start actually acting.
Robin has a poster session
I know, for other
talks
authors,
about it.
and you have to be more active about it. So I think that's kind of, you know, what we're talking about, and it's in that interview. Oh, I love, you know, I love space operas. I love Becky Chambers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well here's Valerie Valdez's new book, which I'm blanking on the name of. But it's a space opera. It's really funny. There's a psychic cat. Hello, librarians. There's a psychic cat in the book. The main character just happens to be Cuban, of Cuban descent, and the author happens to be Cuban American. And it has, you know, all of these cultural touches that deal with being Cuban, but also deal with like video games and deal with, you know, American culture and deal with pop culture. So I'm not starting with, and I love Becky Chambers, like, here's a Cuban book. You know, I mean,
I talk about all the time how the person's identity is not an appeal factor at all, and you shouldn't bring it up. And I actually got challenged once by an African-American librarian when I was in North Carolina. She said, but sometimes you want to bring that out to certain people. I said, that's fine. I said, but I don't start with it, because the reason you like a book or not like a book, like you're explaining, is not because of the identity. So one of the books I've been giving out during this pandemic to everyone who says I want a happy book is The House in the Cerulean Sea by Clune, K-L-U-N-E. And it is a super positive, I call it like the antidote for the bad taste that Harry Potter's left in your mouth. You know, this is like this school for magical children, this orphanage, and this downtrodden British bureaucrat who is just miserable but loves his job, but then goes to this place and finds all these amazing children. And the book is really about understanding differences and accepting people's differences. And it also has a very sweet gay love story. But that's not why you give it to someone, right? It's not like, you know, it's the happy book, sweet, happy, fill you with joy and love and hope for humanity book that people are asking for. I don't even tell them it's necessarily fantasy, because the fantasy elements are frame. They're not, you know, it's when you sometimes say fantasy to people who don't like it, they get worried. There's gonna be trolls and dragons, and it's the frame. And I definitely don't let people know that it's got a gay romance, because I don't want them to find out, because that develops, that would be giving away the ending. And he is very honest in his acknowledgments about how he loves just bringing these books where there are just gay characters who have happy endings, and that's not the plot of the book. So there's
sometimes though that part of that aspect of the frame is important, you know. So again, I'm like contradicting myself, but sometimes like that's a big thing about the book. It's kind of like, who's the person? Which of you is either of you the person who likes the books set in circuses?
Well, I like circuses. Joyce Sarix hates books set in circuses.
Okay.
That's my example.
So you like circuses, right?
Yeah, I do.
You don't care what's in the circus, right?
Not really. No.
Like it's just a circus. That's your hook.
It's like a frame I like. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, like some, you know, people, again, through the reference interview, or excuse me, the RA interview, or through learning, like they are looking for that. You know, they are looking for trans characters. They are looking for those specific things. So that's part of the conversation as well. It's just so often, you know, again, talking about anti-racism, getting back to that, and talking about the structures and the defaults. How often do you give someone a book and say the protagonist is white?
I say that all the time, but Robin needs to go too.
I used to not. I mean,
No, I don't say. That's what I'm saying. Like I say that all the
Yeah.
time. People like you. When do you say the book has a white character? You don't.
Yeah.
You don't point
Yeah.
out when they're white. You don't point out when they're heterosexual. You don't point out when they're not in a wheelchair. You don't point out when they're not neurodiverse. And the fact that you don't do that is a microaggression in and of itself. Every time you do it when they aren't those things.
Yeah, but sometimes I might say I'm Cuban, and so I read books. Like I'm very biased specifically toward books by Cuban Americans, because that's my experience. And it's very different than the Mexican American experience, and it's very different, you know, in some ways, very similar in some ways and different in other ways. So I might actively be on the lookout where that's a selling point from where I'm looking in the catalog. But so a lot of people know, your circus for me is dragons. Like if a book has a dragon in it, like I don't care what's going on. I don't care who's in it. I don't care that. I just like dragon, you know? So we have different entry points, just like people, you know, with thrillers, like if they just really want something fast paced, or if they want a mystery puzzle, or they want, you know, a hard boiled book, it's kind of, you know, finding those appeal factors. In some cases, the frame or the character is the appeal factor, and then you have to delve a little bit deeper into that.
Robin.
Rebecca.
No, go ahead, Robin. I have a question from an audience which fits in here, but I want to hear what Robin has to say on that first.
Well, I mean, most of it has been said. So I scanning through the comments, it's very true that sometimes people want, like someone said, a romance with a Black woman character. And yes, sometimes that is an appeal factor, but also, yes, I'm not going to if someone just comes in and says they want romance, I'm going to suggest all the romances that fit a thing that they might want. So if it's an LGBT romance, I'm going to suggest that. They're going to have to tell me that they don't want that, because I'm going to suggest all the things that fit the criteria that you gave me. So sometimes it is an appeal factor, and people will specifically tell you, I want an LGBT romance with Black characters. And sometimes people will just say, I want a romance set in America in the 1800s. And you better believe I'm giving them, first off, Beverly Jenkins. Mm-hmm. And if they want white people, they're going to have to specifically tell me that's what they want.
So Robin, to use my example, if I come to you and say, I really love Regency romance, like, you know, I like Jane Austen or Mary Balog.
And I'm probably going to give you Vanessa Riley.
Oh, yeah, good.
See, we have live readers advisory happening right here.
or just suggest to you and let you decide, no, I'm not going to read that. But I'm not going to, you know, first off say, well, do you like Black people? Because here's a Black romance. I'm not going to do, you know, any of that. So you'll probably get some KJ Charles too. Does it have to be heterosexual? If it does, that's not for you. But that's a suggestion you're going to get from me.
I think that's the overall point. You just have to suggest books. And when I say lead by example, that's what I mean. Don't bring up, you know, the person, whatever reason you're picking because it's diverse, suggest good books. And I have a talk about all the genres that I update constantly, and it's up to 70% own voices titles now. And that's not me trying. That's all the best critically acclaimed award winners. So, you know, suggest the best book.
Well, and that goes back to reading diversely, or at least reading about books diversely so that you know these authors exist. Mm-hmm. And also going back to, do you have them? You can't suggest what you don't have. Here, I suggest that you go get this book from Amazon because we don't carry it. But, you know, you can't do that. And vice versa. know that your readers are not just reading what you have on the shelf. So before some of these authors got traditional publishing contracts, a lot of them were ebook only. So you may not have had them because they may have been not available in Overdrive. So you didn't have them, but your readers had them, and they're going to come in and say, I want somebody who writes like this. And you're like, who? Because you haven't been keeping track of what's been going on in the genre, or, you know, just in the book world itself. And so your readers are reading beyond you, and that's really not a good place to be in.
I want to address the comment about the Black person who said you want to read books about someone you can identify as a Black person. They're not always been available. And if they were, it was minimal. And I totally understand this. I grew up a Jewish girl in New York suburbs. And literally people give you for your bat mitzvah, okay? You're 13, you're 12. I was 12. Philip Roth to read. Anyone who's read Philip Roth, like Portnoy's Complaint, not what you give a girl for her bat mitzvah. But there were so few examples of being Jewish and coming of age. I totally understand this. And like Annabelle said, she's looking for books about, you know, the Cuban experience. We have to make sure that there is a balance, that we're suggesting books for all experiences to everyone. But as Rebecca said, we don't want to look at someone and assume that they're a certain way or want to only read a certain thing. So we can't assume every Black person only wants Black books. We also can't assume me, who looks like your typical white lady, you know, who's sick of reading books with Jesus in them, would like to read a book about, you know, Jewish characters. You wouldn't know that looking at me or hearing my name. So I think it's important we just don't make assumptions and we just offer everything.
So here's the opposite of that then. So we had a question that popped up that I thought would fit in this discussion right here. And the question is, I had a request for a list from a reader who reads only Patterson, Grisham, Baldacci, Silva. I gave him a list of legal and medical thrillers written mostly by authors of color, titles I was really excited to recommend. The patron didn't specifically say it, but I could tell he was not happy. If anyone has any comments about dealing with patrons who truly do not, who think actually that they truly do not want to engage with diverse content. So maybe Robin, do you have some suggestions for that?
Well, you know, and this is a hard one, because as much as we talk about recommending things, you can't make people read them. You can suggest them, which, you know, I would say is our job, is to suggest as widely as possible, but you can't make people do something they don't want to do. So you can, like you said, put those books in their hand, which is very interesting because one of, I would say, James Patterson's main character is a Black Alex Cross. So where's the line? Like you just don't want Black people writing the book, or so whatever, but you can't make that person read those books. So suggesting those books to them is doing your job. Putting those books out for other people who may not even know they exist is doing your job, but you can't force the person to check out or read those books.
I think I have in those slides on my blog, I actually addressed this question that someone sent me, finding David Baldacci read-alikes that are diverse, because it's also hard too in general. And the thing I found was, and this is another microaggression that happens, a lot of genre books, especially the genres that are less elevated, so like romance, horror, thriller, not so much with mystery, but you see when there's a person of color who writes that book in that genre, they put the word literary in front of it. So it becomes a literary thriller. And people who want a thriller don't want a literary thriller. I know Susan McGuire's on here. Like, I've told her, you can't put the word literary horror in front of my book horror. Not happening. And she makes jokes about it sometimes when she sends me books. This one's literary horror, but I know we can't say that. Like, that just demeans it further. And it happens with people of color in a higher amount. And I wrote about it on that blog post. But you have to just try to suggest them, yes. And I tend to go to award winners, or as I like to say, just making an awards shortlist. You don't have to win. Be on the short list for some of the things like thrillers and mystery especially has gotten a lot more diverse quickly, but with a lot of award-winning authors. But if they showed up on any best lists at all, that is a way I get them when they make that face. Because trust me, they made that face for me too. like, well, this was just up for such and such award. They're like, oh, often they just need a reason to try a new author, especially one with a name maybe that they haven't heard before, that they know is not their standard of what they've read, but give them another reason. They just want to know it's for that. I am not mean, Susan, by the way.
So this is something, this kind of leads into something that we had on our outline that we wanted to talk about during this section, and that is genres. So can we talk a little bit about the different genres and how you would, you know, one of the things we want to talk about too is like the avoiding trauma porn, and how do we sort of lead people if they are looking. We've got a lot of questions that have come up in the chat, people who are interested in specific genres and want to know where they can find authors of color and characters of color in those genres. So what are the things that you guys can speak to about? I know, I think each one of you is probably a different genre expert. So, you know, let's start off with Robin and romance, because we know that that's your jam.
And that's a big one.
Tell us a little bit about how we look at genre through the EDI lens. How about that?
Well, one of the things I was going to say when we were talking about awards is diversify where you're looking for awards books. So specifically for romance, we all know that the Rita Award has had issues in the far past, in the medium past, in the recent past, and has now been retired or sunsetted, and will be resurrected as the Vivian Award for Vivian Stevens. So, but we know in the entire history of the Rita Award, only 2 Black women have won the Rita, and that was in this last award show, which I think was 2019, 2018, I can't remember. So you can't tell me, and these books, some of them have shown up on NPR's Best, New York Times Best, Washington Post Best, New York Public Library's Best, but didn't even final as a Rita Award. So there's some problems there. So diversify where you're getting your awards list. Are you looking at the Lambda Awards? Do you even know about the Emma Awards, which are a diverse award from Romance Slam Jam? You RT Book Lovers, when RT magazine was still publishing, they had awards with some very diverse winners like Sonali Dev or Rebecca Weatherspoon. So diversify your awards so that when you say, well, we gathered from award winners, it's a very diverse pool that you're gathering from.
I use those best lists as award lists too, Robin. Those best lists you mentioned, those are award lists too.
Absolutely, because most of the time they're put together by people who read deeply in the genre. So it's not just picking the one that sold the most, or these are people who are invested in the genre and have done some deep research. As far as looking at romance through an EDI lens, you really have to, you have to go beyond the mainstream. And if you are looking specifically for romance, romance is reviewed in the main journals, but you're only getting the barest tip of the iceberg of books, maybe 5, maybe 7, you know, and the Library Journal and Book List both do things like the romance roundup. And so then you're going to get a much deeper dive, and you're going to get a lot more diverse titles. But even then, in the monthly magazine, the ones you're seeing, you know, Eloisa James, and you're seeing Bev Jenkins. You're not seeing a lot of LGBT. You might see 1 or 2, maybe a month, maybe. So you really, it takes time. There's no magic bullet for it. You have to go out there and do the research to find the books, and you'll see read-alikes for Eloisa James. But 9 times out of 10, those are going to be white read-alikes, because there are so many authors that are publishing so many books. The publishing, it's not just 1 book a year anymore, it's 2 or 3. If you're an indie author, it might be even more than that. So there's a lot to go through. But if you're looking specifically for LGBT authors or Black authors or Latinx authors, you're going to have to do the deep dive. There's just no way around it. One of the best things, though, is that romance readers love to make a list. They love to make a list. So if you Google, you're going to find a Goodreads list. And that Goodreads list is going to at least point you in the right direction. It's going to give you names of authors. So if you're looking for diverse romance beyond Beverly Jenkins, you're going to pull up Vanessa Riley and Piper Hughley, who also write historical diverse romance. So you're going to, but again, you have to do the work, because there's not a clearinghouse for where these books all are. And I wish there were, because it would make it so much easier on people who don't have a lot of time.
And I think that your point, though, about the making lists, but also coming from within the genre and from the fans. So I am the secretary of the Horror Writers Association. And one of the things we do with the horror writers is, many years ago, Linda Addison, who is an African-American science fiction, fantasy, horror poet, she's extremely famous. She started a thing for the horror writers because she was noticing there were too many white males winning all of our awards and on all of our awards lists. So she started something called the Sears Table, S-E-E-R-S table. And it's available on the Horror Writers website at any time. And it literally was a group of it was the Diverse Works Committee. And their goal was to only promote books coming out soon by people of color. They were doing LGBTQ also. And they were focusing on just women too. And they make a list with, and librarians would be so proud, these are authors. It's like a little bit about the author and a start with title, right? And what we've seen, and Linda's written some reports about this for the board, over the last 5 years, as a genre, horror has had some of the most diverse nominee lists of any major award, because we've identified to our membership, the way we vote is both a jury system and members can put things in. It's a dual system. We have had a way to get people to, hey, try this author, read this author. And this person's good, but people didn't know about them because they got lost in the midst of the Stephen Kings and the Joe Hills and everybody else. And it's been wonderful. So many of the writer associations, Romance Writers is working on it now, are working from within to make sure they're including diverse voices. So go to their websites too, the writers associations, and see what they're doing and what they're offering, because it behooves them to diversify their ranks and to get more voices. A great example in horror, this second half of the year are 3 excellent gay or lesbian horror titles coming out, which are not about coming out or, trauma porn of being gay. It's about, there was The Brightlands, which was a debut, and I have a wonderful quote from the author about being gay and what horror did for him in my Library Journal article about the entire genre. There's Plain Bad Heroines, which is coming out this fall by Danforth, which is totally a lesbian horror story, but it's not about being a lesbian. Thank you for the Brightlands love. And then there's another one, an author from science fiction, Sam J. Miller, The Blade Between, is a straight up, creepy small town horror story. And the main character happens to be gay, but it's not about him being gay. It's about, so we're starting to see these things because these authors are allowed to tell their stories, but it's coming from within, from the fight from the authors themselves.
I'm just about to post in the chat the report for change, which the CINC Publishing Committee did for diversity, equity, inclusion in the mystery community. So it is coming from the organizations as well.
Yeah, I guess I can talk about science fiction and fantasy a little bit. On the one hand, there are just so many more choices now being published by larger publishers, so much more than in the past. And we're seeing, N.K. Jemisin, winning all the awards and getting all the accolades. On the other side, if you follow the awards in science fiction and fantasy, it's kind of a dumpster fire as well. So to echo Robin's point, It's just a matter of doing research and looking at NetGalley, looking at Elvice, searching out publisher catalogs, looking at blogs, following not just Twitter, but specific authors on Twitter and seeing who they're recommending and who their author friends are and who's coming up with that. And in some cases, it's really honestly just challenging yourself of, you know, I don't have a lot of representation here. Where can that grow? And in some cases, it might come from a patron question, or it might come, you know, with something being popular. You know, if Gideon the Ninth is really popular with some of your readers, as it is with so many readers, of thinking, you know, I don't have a lot of books that are written from this perspective. Let me search and let me ask and let me question. It's just more work. I mean, I wish there was just say like, and here you go. But there's not. You have to do some of that legwork, and then make sure, do what you can, that those books are also available at your library, either in e-format or in book format. So when you found something great or something that you know that you can recommend a lot, that if you're not buying those books yourself, that you can let the people know, hey, I get a lot of requests for this. You know, I often am asked for a re-like for this or that. Can we get this book?
One of the things that I found was putting up lists. So we're all overdrive from March through the beginning of August. There was nothing but overdrive at our library. So we started putting up a bunch of lists, and I did one on sports romance, which, you know, there's hockey, there's baseball, there's a lot of both of those. There's some football. There wasn't a lot of basketball. There's really not a big surprise why, but there are some basketball romances by Jamie Wesley, and those we could not keep on the shelf. We had them. They were just buried, as stuff tends to get in overdrive. So once you pull it out and show people that you have it, they check it out. That's one of the beautiful things about diversifying your list. There's things that you could have had, you know, for ages that don't necessarily get deleted from overdrive. Sometimes you weed things, but not often, and especially not fiction. And they're just languishing there because they're not new. So people scan the new books and then that's it. Or they search for authors that they know, but this wasn't an author that they knew. So it was new to them. And all of a sudden there's hold lists. Yay.
Rebecca, there we go.
All right, so it is about 3:30, so we've got a half an hour left in the webinar, and we'll shift over into answering some of the questions that have come up, except I will give you guys, I'm looking at our outline that we did beforehand, and I think we hit all the bases you guys wanted to hit, but here's your last chance to pop in any personal story or anything that you wanted to say, and then we'll move into the questions. How does that sound, guys? All right, so.
I just want to give my shout out for listening. I think that I always say Reader's Advisory is 60% listening and 40% talking to patrons. And with this especially if you look like me and you're trying to work with diverse books, which is most of us, by the way. So listen to people who've had experiences, listen to people who want to share anytime they've had a microaggression against them or they have concerns, and, you know, really learn from it. I have a story that I like to tell, and she's on here. Her name's Larissa Glasser. She's a librarian. She's trans and she's an archivist. And I learned so much by watching Victor Laval, who is a Black horror writer, listen to Larissa answer a question at a StokerCon. I watched him enthralled, his hand here turned, looking at her, as she described, and it was on a, you know, diverse authors panel. And I watched him listen to her. At the time, he was becoming a household name and she was not. And he gave her the respect and the distance to listen to her experience, an experience he did not have. And what I learned from that is watching him listen to her, I understood that we all have to listen to everyone. And I learned so much from that. And that's because why I became friends with her, because then we started talking. And, you know, his answer was, whatever that question was, I don't remember, but I always remember his answer because it was what she said. I have nothing to add. So we all can learn by listening. I just think that's important.
Going along with that is my thing about become involved in the book atmosphere, the book ecosphere. When again, there were no conferences. They did BookCon from Facebook. And so they had a bunch of panels. It was almost like being there, but not, because no bags. But one of the panels that they had, it was there was no people who were not non-binary on the panel. So an entire panel of non-binary authors. I had never seen that before. And I sat there like this the whole time, just listening. Like, most of them wrote children or YA, and I buy YA now, so that's why I was there. But it's just, you learn so much just by being in the room and by listening to people when they tell you their experiences.
All right, we've got everybody back here.
All right.
No, that's right. So let's go and talk about some of the questions that have come through. So we've got a little less than a half an hour left. So we'll get to as many as we can, and as many that our fine panelists can actually answer. Several things have come up in both the chat and in the Q&A box asking about nonfiction. And a couple people have actually mentioned that nonfiction readers advisory, like, that's a whole separate webinar. So I don't know that we'll be able to give a full answer for that right now, but maybe you guys can talk a little bit about your experience with nonfiction, both collection development and readers advisory, as far as diversity and anti-racism goes.
My nonfiction experience is long in the past. I don't think I've done anything as far as collection building for nonfiction since like 2008. So I am going to defer.
I work with nonfiction readers all the time, and I've ordered for nonfiction. Nonfiction is a much larger issue because most of our nonfiction collections at libraries across the entire American sphere, whether they're academic or public, are so focused overall and overwhelmingly on that white, heteronormative, able-bodied experience in general, so that our collections make, you know, people of color, Black, Indigenous, LGBT feel uncomfortable just being there, because to find the books is so difficult. And I actually think that diversity audits are even more important in nonfiction because of that reason. That being said, it's difficult because every topic needs to be diversified. Like, every historical, you know, category. I used to buy a lot of biography, and I was not a lot, I bought all the biographies for my library. And I went out of my way to not just, we're in Illinois, not just have, you know, the new Lincoln biography and the new, you know, gangster biography and the new Michael Jordan biography. Like, we needed to diversify the experiences all over the place. But it's hard, and you have to look, because, you know, I mean, I hate to be trite and quote like a Hamilton and stuff, but who tells the story, you know, who lives to tell the story is the one that gets to tell it. And, you know, I know that seeking out books about, you know, Jewish experience that isn't the Holocaust as a child, you know, was hard enough. And that's still mostly white people, right? So it's very important. I think things like the 1619 Project are where we need to start, talking about this idea of recentering our historical view. You know, the 1619 Project purposely says, you know, we're talking about the first slave ships that came over before 1620 with the Mayflower. And I think it's really important. But then there's the question of what about the, you know, Indigenous experience even before that? So there's a lot to do there. I think what you just need to do is ask yourself, with each topic that you have someone who's interested in, are they getting as full a picture of an experience as they can be getting?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that, you know, nonfiction is a big topic, obviously. And I get a lot of questions about how do you do a nonfiction diversity audit? And it's like, well, again, you have to break it down, because it's one thing if you're auditing, you know, your test books, I guess, you know, I mean, like your SAT books, I know which now they're not doing that anymore, so I guess you should read those, versus something that is frequently used in advisory, like biography, like memoir, like history, and start with those. And yeah, I think it just comes down to seeing what you have and what you're recommending and trying to get more perspectives. They are out there, but they are far in between. In some cases, you know, to Robin's point, kind of in looking at indie, sometimes you have to look to university press for nonfiction. Sometimes you have to look to just very wide-ranging sources that you wouldn't before, and then just be aware of this frame as you're suggesting books, and as you're buying them. It's very, very tricky. I mean, there's just you know, in some categories, there's just hardly anything there right now that is obvious, where you really would have to do some digging. And sometimes I think in nonfiction too, like history is a good example of just also an awareness of, you know, I know in our library, we're as guilty of this as everyone else. We have like 25 billion World War II books, and, you know, 25 gazillion American history books based on, you know, United States, but we have hardly any books on current books, hardly any comparatively on Africa or Asia or South America. So part of it is looking at those balances as well.
Great. So we have a question that came through for any of you to answer. What strategies would you suggest for working with library leadership who say they are centering race in services, but who seem to have a bias that reader services is for dominant cultures only, compounded by what seems to be a tacit belief that service to adult readers is not really essential service? So you guys have had a chance to talk about, you know, fixing your own reading and helping your colleagues and your patrons. So can you speak a little bit about how do we help the administration also recognize that this is an important thing to do?
I'm going to go last because I have so much to say about this. So you guys go.
I would say, so there's, in speaking for collection development, there can be so many barriers that have to be removed administratively, such as we can only order from this source, or we have to do it this way with a purchase order. We can't order from someone's website, even if they're local. I mean, there's lots of things that could get in the way. The policy about needing reviews before you buy, or there was one that was just on the tip of my tongue and I can't remember, but that's enough. That's enough barriers that you get the gist of what I mean. And sometimes you just have to chip away at them. So you start with your boss. And if your boss is part of the administrative team or structure, then you're basically starting at the place where they can take that to the director, who else is on that administrative team, and get that barrier removed. So it really, again, there's no magic bullet. You can't just show them a report and say, well, this says, you know, we don't have as many books by these people as we'd want, and we can't do that without this. You have to do it piece by piece. And I've done that. It takes forever, but eventually they understand that we want to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in our collection. We can't do that if we're not ordering from a place that carries books that are equitable, diverse, and inclusive. So we need to look for a different way. We need to do credit card orders, or we need to not have a sole vendor, but perhaps a primary vendor and a secondary vendor. We order 90% of our stuff from you, but we're gonna order 10% of the stuff from a different vendor or from Amazon, blah, 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 so that we can diversify our collection, which you've stated is a priority. So use their language if it's written down in a mission statement, or if they're doing a strategic plan and they've put all of this, and it's usually, I will say as an adult librarian, it's usually focused on children's services. We're going to do diverse story times, and we're going to use that language to forward ideas that make it easier to get it done.
Yeah, I'd add to referencing back to something Robin said earlier, use data, like show them, hey, this is how much this checked out in overdrive. Hey, this was patron feedback, solicit patrons. Hey, would you mind writing a comment card that I love this book and want more of this? Don't have any shame in that. That's what administrators want. They want to make the public happy. So to the degree that you can use their language, and this is what patrons are saying, and this is the data we're seeing to help support all the other initiatives is, I think, helpful, or can be helpful.
If you have patron requests, and if they're automated in some way, not just a paper form, but if you can forward requests to an administrator, your boss, and say, this is the 17th request for lesbian fiction that I've gotten this month, and we're not buying it because I can only find it at Ingram, and we can only buy from Baker and Taylor. Like data, like you said, so that you can say, it's not just that it's a feeling I have. This is a request, this is patron generated collection development.
And I'm going to speak because I both ran a reader's advisory desk and I've been a trustee. I see it from both sides. First of all, I never had shame telling my patrons to request things they liked. I gave them the form. I had my book club fill things out when we were done with and give them in. No shame. You have to, and someone put this in the chat, and it's exactly what you guys are saying. Use the words the organization's using, use the goals of the organization. But I want to go back before I talk about this specifically and address another part of the question Rebecca brought up, the idea that adult readers advisory, and Robin hinted at it, isn't worth it, not like the children's. And here's the thing I've learned as one of the biggest readers advisory consultants in the country. The pandemic has shown libraries, even the ones that never said they would hire me, that without adult readers advisory, they are in big trouble. I am inundated with libraries who are having to immediately ramp up their readers advisory because all they can do is curbside, and they have to show that they're, I worked with someone's there from Des Moines, Iowa. I worked with them with their service to make it more participatory, that show that the staff are helping. Adult readers advisory, when I left being in a public service desk to do this full time, I had directors outright tell me, no one's going to hire you. No one's going to pay you to talk about readers advisory. I've been hired by some of the largest libraries in the country to talk about readers advisory to every staff member, because it's a core service when we're talking about serving adults. And the pandemic has shown that. So that part, I think that argument is going away. But in terms of getting change, look, change is slow in libraries. And those of you who know me, I'm a Jersey girl. I don't deal with slow change, okay? I made change. And I stood up to the people in charge at my library. So when they refused to go fine free, and it had to do with the city, not the library, I just started subbing at the circulation desk and waiving everyone's fines. I mean, literally everyone's fines. And you know what happened? People said to the library, this was so great, we had this reason. Now, I worked in a lower income community, so I had people come with their quarters that they were going to use to do their laundry to pay their fines. And I was like, no, you're not. But even people who didn't have, I'm like, you know what, not if you're doing it every day, but if you're not an abuser. And guess what? Now libraries are waiving their fines. When I was on a library board, we waived our fines. I demanded we do it. So there's change. And that is, by the way, an EDI situation. That shows your community that you believe that everybody should have access to the library because they've already paid for the library. So I don't want to leave that out of the conversation because it's extremely important and a part we haven't discussed. But the fact of the matter is, you want to show you're equitable, diverse, and inclusive, just start doing it. Make the change, like Robin said, go to your immediate boss and start making the change. And just do it, because you're going to make people happy and they're going to write in and say to them, you liked this, write in. You know, I took the time with you. I have examples of helping people with their visas and their green card applications a lot because I was near the front door. I had a guy try to leave me $10 as a tip for helping him. And I'm like, first of all, I'm not losing my job for $10. Take your money back. Why don't you write a letter saying how great it was? And you know what? I helped so many people with that. We then got a person just to handle citizenship at our library, right? And now we have somebody who does all of that. So do it. Just don't wait for somebody to tell you it's okay to do it. Just start doing what you think is right. Because I'm going to promise you, if you're truly right and putting everybody else first and they're the equity, diversity, inclusion, you're going to have patrons happy with it. And that's all the trustees care about. We want to see those happy comments. So just do it. Don't worry about it.
So we've got about 10 minutes to wrap up here. There's lots of questions, of course, that have come through. We're not going to get to them all, and I'm sorry about that. But I do want to get to this question because I think you'll each have something interesting to say about it. So Misha asks, anti-racist readers advisory means that we are starting to push back on some of what we had previously learned about RA and libraries regarding neutrality. How do we approach conversations around problematic authors or problematic books? Robin, I see your sly little smile going on there. Becky and Annabelle are nodding. Who wants to? Well,
I'll just do real quick. Let's take American Dirt, because I wrote about that. So you can find that on my blog. I'm just going to take American Dirt as an example. Please, I hope you all know you should not be giving that book out. But a lot of libraries said to me, I can't not buy copies of American Dirt because my collection development policy says that I have to buy for so many holds and I have to, if it's a bestseller, I have to add it. Okay, yes, fine, but you don't have to promote it. And instead, why not put up a display? I mean, American Dirt is racist, but you don't say that. But you know, American Dirt is not a good representation. Here are books that are, right? And that's what I said to do. And that's what I encourage libraries to do who said that to me. Like, how do we get around this? And I said, that's how you do it. You use it as an example and you say, this is probably not the book you should read. Here's why. Here are the books you should read.
Or not should, but can.
Can.
And yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I would say, of course you have to buy American Dirt. Like, it's the book everybody's talking about, and it's, you know, on every bestseller list. And Oprah, it was an Oprah book. Like, what other Oprah books did you not buy? Of course you have to buy American Dirt. But you have an opportunity to then go to the stacks, those things that have been overlooked. You know, they were on the new book shelf, but they never made a RA list. So they've moved to the regular shelf where they languish, and soon they will be weeded because they haven't gone out. And you can pull those books and make a display that is like the American Dirt. Try these books. You know, I mean, there's ways that you can mitigate the harm of books without just saying, well, we're not going to buy it, we're not going to have it in the collection, which you can't do.
So American Dirt, which is, what's the book equivalent of A Whipping Boy? Like, it's just like, everyone is very angry about it. Or not everyone. Part of the anger, though, is because of the promotion it received. I mean, part of the ire is not that it existed, but that it got so much press and so many blurbs and so much focus. So, you know, we do have, you know, in some cases, you know, we don't have control over something being popular, but we can, to an extent, control what we promote ourselves. And so if someone, and there's also a difference, I think, between someone coming in and specifically asking for American Dirt, or someone coming in and asking for books about Mexico or about undocumented workers or about something and giving them American dirt. I mean, those are different things. So I think, again, like elevating the voices that aren't given the promotion is a way to focus in those questions. I mean, I think, you know, this is about RA, but that's comes to the classic like debates on collection development for both fiction and nonfiction, and, you know, intellectual freedom and being a library. I mean, but if someone comes asking for just a good book and I'm giving them American dirt, that is different than someone specifically asking for American dirt and having me give it to them, but then also say, you know, why are you interested in, you know, how did you hear about the book? What kind of books do you like? What are you in the mood for? And then taking that path to then make other suggestions.
I also think that this is the whole point about the not being neutral. And somebody also brought up in the chat, you know, American Dirt is one example, but what about an example like Harry Potter, right? Because Rebecca brought up that too, like when an author becomes problematic themselves. So first of all, Rebecca also made the point of, yes, we were taught that libraries are neutral, but I've never thought libraries were neutral. I've always used my position on a public desk to advocate for the things that are right. And I worked, like I said, I worked in a community where there were issues that we had to advocate for because the city wasn't advocating for the people, especially the ones who weren't legal, who were a lot of our residents and patrons. And I think that, you know, saying libraries are supposed to be neutral, they were never neutral. I'm done with that. So just stop treating it that way. But when an author becomes problematic, it is hard. And someone brought this up about American Dirt in the chat too. Mexican Americans who like it, people who still love the Harry Potter books but don't like J.K. Rowling. I think Annabelle brought it up, and so did Robin. They both brought up this issue. You have to lessen the harm you're doing. So if you ask for American Dirt, I give it to you, but I say, hey, just so you know, there was some controversy about this book. And then maybe give them an article or something about it. So read it and let me know. Or if there were Mexican American authors who liked, Mexican American people who liked the book. And I think a lot more of that speaks to the fact that there's not enough written about their perspective. So they saw something in themselves in it. And that if there were authors they knew about that did this more from an own voices perspective, they'd like it more. But we have to just make people clear, like, are you asking for Harry Potter because it's, you know, a classic that you want to read? Are you asking for Little House on the Prairie because it's a classic you want to read? Okay, well, here's what you need to know. Here are some problematic things about it. You can do with that what you want, but it's our job to make sure they're aware and that know that, you know, Little House on the Prairie was a great book at its time, but it has great problems. I try to use the same word too, you know, that we need to acknowledge today. So.
And just to address something that just came up in the chat, do you think librarians should read American Dirt in order to understand the criticism and why it's so popular? I feel like if you want to, if you're interested in, you know, a thriller that has these themes and you want to read it, like if you hate thrillers, I'm not going to say that you should read American Dirt just to understand the criticism. You can read about it, like Becky suggests. Reading about something is a good way to learn about it and know the issues around it without having to read it. But if that's your thing and you want to read it, absolutely. So that you actually know what the book is and what the book isn't, and then read the criticism of it and read the defense of it and get a well-rounded, you know, explanation on all sides. If that is a thing that you would read, you would have read anyway.
I think Sean brings up a good point. He said, if I were the one offering him this book and said, hey, there's some people who have some problematic nature about this book, you'd walk away. And that's your right. But I can't in good conscience give out American Dirt and not say, hey, one of the reasons it's a bestseller is there's a lot of controversy about it. And if you're interested in the controversy, let me give you a thing. I'm not going to tell them my personal opinion of the controversy, but I am going to let them know it's there and give them the resources, because that's what I do as a librarian. I don't just, if someone asks me a question, I don't give my opinion. ever. I give a resource and I let people know about the things they wouldn't know about on their own. And if that person isn't going to work, you know, with me, that's fine. Go have someone else help you. But, you know, I'm doing pretty well doing this. So I think it's working out.
All right, so we have hit the top of the hour here. I know that we weren't able to get to all of the questions today, but we've run out of time. I really wanted to thank all of you for joining us today. This is our first Library Reads live webinar, so thank you for making it such a good one. We have done webinars on genre training along with Novelist, and you can find those on our website. And we also have some training videos, and we've got a new one that's coming up in the next 2 weeks on Reader's Advisory 101, so look for that as well. But this is our very first live discussion one. We hope to have more of these Library Reads in Conversation programs coming up. I want to thank our fantastic panelists today, Annabelle, Robin, Becky. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to put something up on the screen here super quick, just so that you know. We do have the recording of this. It's just me handling this, so be gentle and give me some time to get it up there. It'll be on our YouTube channel shortly. I've been saving the chat and the Q&A, so we'll have that transcript as well, and I can email that to everyone who participated, and then I can eventually link it onto that YouTube channel also. So make sure that you're paying attention to our website, which is www.libraryreads.org. We have a whole page there on these different events that we do. We also have pages about the other stuff that we do, so please check it out, especially if you're not already somebody who participates in the voting for titles every month. So again, I want to thank you all for coming and participating. I want to thank our wonderful panelists, and thanks for taking the time to learn about this topic.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.